Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors in partnership with the Boston Public Library and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, in New York and Hollywood, looking at the life of one creative musical genius, his family, and the Great American Songbook. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book Ira Gershwin, A Life in Words by Michael Owen. Mr. Owen will soon take the stage, the screen, and for 20 minutes he'll discuss his book, show historical images, and play some audio clips. After that, he'll be joined in conversation by musicologist Mark Clegg from the University of Michigan. Professor Clegg will also pose your questions to our guest author. You can enter those at any time into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So locate that button now and please make use of this. We would love to hear from you and hear your questions for tonight. Tonight's event is being recorded by my colleagues in American Ancestors Brew Family Learning Center. A video will be shared in the hours ahead with all registered attendees, more than 500 of you. In the coming weeks, our partners at GBH Forum Network will publish their produced version. Links for both videos have been shared in the chat, so refer back to those and you'll also get a heads up over email. Of course, the real enlightenment and enjoyment, great awareness of our musical history, this comes from reading tonight's featured work. Copies of the hardcover Ira Gershwin, A Life in Words, can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I enjoyed this biography enormously. It's a treasure trove of musical history and family history, painting a rich picture of American culture and the immigrant experience on both coasts. If you order it from Porter Square Books, input the code AMINS24 and your book will come signed by the author on a book plate. These special copies can be sent to you, your friends, or family anywhere in the United States, something for you or as a gift. Now for some background on tonight's author, over to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Margaret. Good evening and welcome from the Boston Public Library. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kristen Motti, a programs librarian at the Central Library of the Boston Public Library. The BPL is thrilled to be co-presenting tonight's program, especially because it's very much aligned with our 2024 programmatic theme, Revolutionary Music, and our upcoming theme for 2025, Revolutionary Art. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing our featured author, Michael Owen. A cultural historian and researcher, Michael Owen acts as the consulting archivist to the estate of Ira Gershwin. He is also the author of Go Slow, The Life of Julie London, and the editor of the recently published The Gershwins Abroad. He's joining us tonight from Wisconsin. We'll meet him in just a moment, but first, Margaret, back over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm delighted to welcome back to the series tonight's moderator. In 2022, Mark Clegg joined us with his book, Oh, Say Can You Hear? A Cultural History of the Star-Spangled Banner. That celebrated work was a New York Times editor choice. For his day job, Professor Clegg is a musicologist at the University of Michigan, where he is also director of the Gershwin Initiative and executive director of the university's Arts Initiative. He will join us in the second half of the program, but for now, a big welcome to you, Michael Owen. We are glad you're with us tonight. There is a lot to cover here, from Gershwin family history on Manhattan's Lower East Side, the celebrated Broadway shows, the blockbuster films. These Gershwins were truly amazing. I have heard from some friends, some fellow music lovers, that your NPR Fresh Air interview was also amazing. So I know we're in for a real treat with tonight's program. So let's not delay. Let's start right in. Over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about my book, Ira Gershwin, Life in Words. I'd like to start the evening by quoting from a few of Ira's lyrics, and I'll quote from them. I won't sing them. You'll be happy about that. Someday he'll come along, the man I love. Foggy day in London town, had me low and it had me down. Nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you try. They're writing songs of love, but not for me. You say either, and I say either. You say neither, and I say neither. They all laughed at Christopher Columbus when he said the world was round. It's very clear our love is here to stay, not for a year, but ever and a day. How many of those did you recognize? Those were just a small sample of the words of more than 700 lyrics written by Ira Gershwin, one of the songwriters responsible for what is now known as the Great American Songbook. Those songs written largely for Broadway and Hollywood between the 1920s and the 1950s. And on your screen, you're seeing a few of the sheet music covers of those songs. These words encapsulate Ira's style, words that evoke an emotional response, whether sadness or joy, often both. They're not words merely thrown together to create a sound, to create an easy rhyme, but they're the result of an extensive struggle on his part to create a synthesis of words and music, a precision that crafted each syllable to the appropriate note in the musical score of the composer he was working with. To some, he was known as the jeweler. Writing a biography of Ira Gershwin, a man who was so self-effacing, yet who left a huge paper trail of archival material, wasn't an easy task. Analyzing thousands of letters, not just Ira's, contracts and legal agreements, photographs, scripts, programs, and other primary source material literally took years. Fortunately, my having managed Ira Gershwin's archive for many years helped. At least I knew where to start looking. To tell Ira's story in the amount of time I have here tonight is even more difficult, but I'll give you an overview by laying out my look at Ira in 4 parts. His early life, his career as a lyricist during the lifetime of his brother George, his career as a lyricist following George's death, and his final years. Ira Gershwin was born on December 6th, 1896 at 60 Eldridge Street on the Lower East Side of New York City. He and his 3 siblings, his 3 younger siblings, George, born 2 years after Ira, Arthur, born in 1900, and his sister Frances, born 10 years to the day after Ira and known as Frankie, were first-generation Americans. And I should say, since we're so close to the date, happy birthday to Ira and Frankie in 3 days. Their parents, Moishe Gershovitz and Rosa Bruskin, had left the Russian Empire in the early 1890s with the hope for a better, safer life than that experienced by many Jews under the rule of the Tsar. They were among the more than 2 million Eastern European Jews who emigrated to the United States in the late 19th century, and they changed the demographics of the cities in which they lived. In 1870, for example, there were only 60,000 Jews in New York City, or less than 1% of the population. 40 years later, there were 1.1 million Jews, or nearly a quarter of the population. Moishe and Rosa soon became Morris and Rose, and Gershovitz became Gershwin, and eventually Gershwin. The family was, for the most part, a secular one. Ira was the only child to have a bar mitzvah. And their most remarkable trait, maybe just the most remarkable trait of their children, and most famously George and Ira, was their self-proclaimed identity as Americans. They were eager to be successful, eager to leave the ways of the old country behind, eager to become Americans. As a boy in this new American century, Ira found his life to be full of surprises, but often bewildering and fatiguing. His brother George was more adaptable, constantly absorbing new experiences. George got into street fights, arrived home with black eyes. As Ira recalled, we were in two completely different worlds. Ira's Lower East Side childhood was a world of smells and tastes, a world of noise and visually arresting sights. The sound of horses' hooves and the rattle of the wagons they led, the rumble of the electrified trolleys on their tracks, the metal on metal grating of the elevated railway, the shouts of peddlers selling every item imaginable from their pushcarts. He lived in an exciting city that was the center of a newly urbanized America. But it was a dangerous city. The affable young men who used to hang around the neighborhood and encourage Ira and George in roller skating contests sometimes turned out to be gangsters. But what Ira loved more than anything was words, reading them in whatever form he could find. And he graduated from newspaper comic strips and adventure magazines to checking out more intellectual fare from the local libraries. His reading and his walking through the streets of New York broadened his mind and exposed him to new ideas and the language of the American people. He initially wanted to be a newspaper columnist under the influence of Franklin P. Adams, then the most popular columnist in the United States. He joined many of his contemporaries, including some he would later work with, such as the playwrights George S. Kaufman and Maury Riskin, in submitting pieces of light verse to Adams. But for Ira, publication was a rarity. The most important advice he ever received came from another writer, the Englishman Paul Potter, the author of the theatrical adaptation of the popular novel Trilby. And it was to learn your American slang. Additionally, Potter advised Ira that a writer didn't have to be a participant in an event to write about it. Art could be created from observation. At the same time as Ira was mulling over his career choices, George Gershwin was making his name as a songwriter, most particularly with the hit song Swanee, with lyrics by Irving Caesar. Ira knew he was a better lyricist than Caesar, but what George needed at this stage of his career was a speedy lyricist. And in these early years, Ira was the tortoise to George's hare. But he kept trying, and his style and facility as a lyricist developed under the influence of two of his other idols, W.S. Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, and P.G. Wodehouse, best known now for his comic novels, but in those days, a successful lyricist with composers such as Jerome Kern. In 1918, when Ira was 22, he wrote The Real American Folk Song is a Rag. It was his first attempt at a song lyric that he felt came up to his exacting standards. Sadly, it never made it into a Broadway show and wasn't published until the late 1950s. It took 4 more years, until 1922, for Ira to have a truly successful song. I'll Build a Stairway to Paradise was featured in an edition of the popular George White Scandals review, but it's probably best remembered as the lavish production number in the 1951 Oscar-winning movie musical, An American in Paris. In 1921, the year before that song became a hit, Ira wrote his first Broadway show. Two Little Girls in Blue, a musical comedy written with the composer Vincent Youmans, was actually slightly more successful than George's attempts for the stage to this point. But neither brother could say he was entirely satisfied with his career. Then came 1924, the year of George's game-changing Rhapsody in Blue and the creation of the Gershwin identity. Ira was 28, George was 26, and all the parts were falling into place to meld their careers. But they needed a show that was of the moment, that caught the jazz age zeitgeist. Lady Be Good, with the combination of George's melodies, Ira's sprightly lyrics, and the sparkling stage presence of the brother and sister team of Fred and Adele Astaire, brought the theatrical success everyone had been waiting for. From that point on, George and Ira were a team. The extrovert composer balanced to some extent by the introvert lyricist. George the music, and Ira the words. Their Broadway and Hollywood career of shows and movie scores over the next 13 years took place alongside George's career as a concert hall composer and performer. And Ira was never less than amazed by his brother's ability to manage all this activity simultaneously. I thought here that you might like to listen to Ira's voice, taken from a rare interview. Ira didn't like the sound of his voice, so he was usually reluctant to be recorded.
In person, my brother was a good deal like his music, vibrant, dynamic, and honest, and, if I may, charming. He was full of life and lived a full day. Although most of it was devoted to the piano and his music, it was a continual source of amazement to me that he found time to engage in so many other activities. He was a fine painter, a good golfer, a discerning and courageous art collector, an excellent photographer, a wonderful dancer, whether at a ballroom or taking a moment out of his show rehearsal to break into a tap dance. And socially, he was one of the most sought-after young men in New York, or whatever city he happened to be in. George moved fast, lived fast, studied hard, and learned fast.
The two self-portraits you're seeing on your screen now, Ira on the left in his yellow underwear, George in a top hat and tails, is a reflection of how they saw themselves, or at least how Ira painted himself in reaction to George's formal portrait. And incidentally, Ira dyed the underwear himself in a bathtub. I should say here, I think that the title of my book, Ira Gershwin, A Life in Words, is meant to be taken in at least a couple of different ways. A biography can be defined as a life in words, and Ira's life was surrounded by words. But there's also a pun for those who like this sort of thing. Ira's was a life in words, as opposed to his brother's outwards life. Through hits like Okay and Funny Face, Strike Up the Band, and the Pulitzer Prize winning political satire of the I Sing, Ira stood alongside George as two artists at the top of their game. Their work together on the New York stage concluded in 1935 with George's now classic opera Porgy and Bess, written with DuBose Hayward. And this was followed by a 3-picture deal in Hollywood to write songs for musicals at RKO Studios and for the producer Samuel Goldwyn. The songs that came from this brief period were among the greatest of the brothers' work, but it was during this time in Hollywood that George became ill and unexpectedly died of a brain tumor at the age of 38, leaving the score for the last movie incomplete. This was the moment at which Ira Gershwin's life forever changed. The effect of George's death could not be measured. Would he carry on as a songwriter without his brother? Could he? Did he even want to? These were among the questions he faced after July 11th, 1937. For almost 3 years, most of Ira's time was spent in mourning, while he tried to organize George's papers for safekeeping and dealt with the demands of his mother and the many lawyers who became part of his life. Although the answer to all the questions I asked eventually became yes, and Ira would go on to create words with new music until the mid-1950s, his life at times was an uneven balance. as he fed his need to create, while at the same time heeding an inner call to keep the flame of his brother's music alive. During the years of his work with George, Ira had collaborated with other composers, Harold Arlen and Vernon Duke, on two reasonably successful revues, shows with a series of songs and sketches, but not much of a plot to hang them on, or none at all. But there was a unique character to Ira's partnership with George, a symbiotic, familial relationship that couldn't be duplicated, no matter how much Ira tried. And while some of his most popular songs, Long Ago and Far Away, written with Jerome Kern, and The Man That Got Away with Harold Arlen among them, both nominated for Best Original Song Oscar, and his most successful Broadway show, Lady in the Dark, written with the German emigre composer Kurt Weill, came during the decades after George's death, his brother was never far from the forefront of his mind. The love he had for George, the thoughts of whether he could have saved him, and what they could have accomplished together had George lived. Still, Ira carried on through heartache and uncertainty. The Beverly Hills home that he shared with Leonore Lee Strunsky Gershwin, his wife of more than 50 years, became the scene of many celebrity-filled parties. It was said that if the porch light was still on, you were welcome to come in. Many of these evenings included singing around the piano, and Ira, on occasion, could be persuaded to join in with a voice that was difficult to listen to sometimes, but quite effective, particularly on his own comedic numbers, including this little ditty, which was cut from the score of an otherwise forgettable movie musical called Give a Girl a Break.
Ach du liebe Papa, when the band commences. Ach du liebe Papa, makes you lose the senses. We don't fingermeister singer, but Austrasian waltzes makes the people longer linger on the traffic pulses. On the lovely Papa, we are standing pat. Listen how sublime it is, rhythm and rhyme it is. But for us now time it is to pass the hat.
By the mid-1950s, Ira Gershwin and many of his compatriots had to face a changed world of music. Broadway musicals were becoming more expensive to produce, and the types of generally lighthearted songs that Ira wrote were losing their luster. Movie musicals were disappearing, and movie title songs, a field that was lucrative for some lyricists like Johnny Mercer and Sammy Cahn, was anathema to Ira, who needed more character and plot before he could create his magic. And so his thoughts turned to preservation and an archive to house his and his brother's papers. The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. had begun collecting George Gershwin's original musical manuscripts in the 1940s. Ira would donate his own papers there too. But he continued to keep his own private collection at his home in Beverly Hills. And he would use this material to persuade his publishers to issue some of his brother's unpublished songs, including one he especially enjoyed, Hi Ho, which Tony Bennett recorded in 1968. His papers were also an aide de memoire during the long gestation of his 1959 book, Lyrics on Several Occasions. And most importantly, it was a way to keep George alive. The work that benefited the most from Ira's stewardship was Porgy and Bess. Ira's hand guided the ongoing career of the opera from its first full revival in the 1940s through the very successful production of the 1950s that toured around the world. That tour brought Ira Gershwin to the Soviet Union, where he joined the company during its performances there. The Samuel Goldwyn movie version of 1959 and a Columbia cast recording brought Porgy and Bess to a wider audience than theatergoers. In 1976, the Houston Grand Opera restored George's Pride and Joy to its original pre-Broadway length. Thanks in large part to Ira's efforts, Porgy and Bess is now part of a standard operatic repertoire, and George Gershwin's music is programmed by orchestras beyond the once typical Pops concerts. The 7 lyrics I read excerpts from at the beginning of this talk are indelibly meshed with George Gershwin's brilliant, now classic melodies. Those melodies are what we hear, but Ira Gershwin's words, romantic or comedic, often both simultaneously, are what we sing. And whether we sing them professionally, sing them in the shower, sing them as love songs to our partners, or sing them as lullabies to our children, we remember them for their wit, for their charm, and for their timelessness. Ira often found it difficult to believe that decades after their creation, his lyrics were still being sung. So he would be amazed to discover that 40 years after his death, those same words still delight and continue to reach the hearts of new multi-generational audiences. Thanks to all of you for joining me for this brief look at Ira Gershwin's life and career. I hope you enjoyed it. And now I would like to introduce Professor Mark Clegg, who's going to join me for the second half of the evening. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Michael, great to see you, and congratulations. I mean,
thank you.
I have my copy of your book right here, and pre-ordered, arrived just a few days ago, though. But
thank you. Yes, people are getting the books. I hear that.
Yeah, it's been a delight for me to read it, and I just find your prose just crisp and clear, and you tell the story of Ira, without getting in the way, and I think there's I guess I wondered a little bit about your approach to writing biography, and what was it about this? What did you want to accomplish with this book?
Well, I think I had 2 goals. Initially, my initial goal was to try to get people to understand that Ira had a career beyond the work that he did with George. If Ira Gershwin is known by the general public, it's because of the work that he did with his brother. But as I say in the book, and as I just mentioned, he wrote with a lot of other different composers. And so I thought people should know about that. But I also felt like people needed to, or would be interested in, reading about his life prior to fame. So up to 1924 or so, and his first successful show, and how the difficulties of his life, and they were not unusual difficulties for the general public, but his also in terms of how he struggled to find who he was going to be as a writer. He knew he wanted to be a writer, but what sort of a writer was it? And so how did he get from where he began to Lady Be Good, and how to bring those 2 stories together of his early days and then his other career.
Well, it's sort of stunning that this is the first biography of Ira, and it's 40 years after his death. And I mean, Philip Fury wrote the book about sort of him as a lyricist, right? So there's been some stuff out there, and of course, there are lots of biographies of George, and Ira's always sort of a subsidiary character. But I think part of what made your book so fresh for me was it was the first time that Ira sort of came out of the shadows and was really focused on, learned about his love of light verse and his writing for the, student newspapers in high school and college, and just his own ambitions as a humorist, early on. And for me, that was really revelatory, because I'd never seen Ira put center stage in the way your book does. So, I guess 2 questions. What, I think so often when we hear about Ira, it's really as a reflection or as a counterpart to George, right? As sort of George's opposite. And yet that's also sort of, I guess I wonder, is that true, or does it distort our understanding of one or both brothers? Were there things that they had in common that we never talk about because we're so busy talking about how they were different?
Well, I think Ira would be the first to acknowledge that his career would never have been what it was if it hadn't been for George, for his partnership with George. Um, I think one of the things that they had in common, and I do mention it in the book, is that for almost their entire lives, they lived in the same house.
Hmm.
So they were very close. The furthest apart they were was across the street from one another in their last places in New York City. Other than that, they either lived with their family, their parents and their siblings, until the late 1920s, or they lived in penthouse apartments. So they next to each other. So they were always very geographically close to one another, but they were completely different personalities. And George, this very meteoric person who rose from nowhere, but who then entertained everyone, and Ira, who stayed in the background. And so these are cliches in the Gershwin story, but they are also truisms. And so to say that Ira was a different person, I think I can't say that, but I can say that he had his own personality, which I hope I'm bringing forward in this book, so that people can understand a bit about where he came from, how he got to be who he was, and how he was able to carry on after this devastating event in 1937.
Yeah, we're getting a bunch of questions from our audience really about the relationship between the brothers and their family. And I have to say, I've always felt a certain connection with Ira just because as a researcher of the music of George and Ira, if you go to the Library of Congress, you'll pull out these folders and there'll be sort of a loose sheet of papers. And every once in a while, there's a little note attached, this sort of says this scrap of paper, is from a discarded song, or, that we were going to use for this show, but we didn't. And so you get these little notes from Ira sort of serving as a guide. And so
Yeah.
I've always felt that Ira was in some ways the first historian of George's life. I mean, because he so carefully curated that legacy, as you talked about. And so I guess one of the questions we're getting is, what were Ira's feelings about his brother? Was he really jealous of his success, as one might assume, or was there a real admiration and connection? How would you describe how Ira felt about George?
A true deep admiration for what George did, for what George did as a composer, as a performer, as a man. In the audio that I played from the interview, I think what Ira said really did describe his feelings for his brother. He was amazed by what George was able to do. If there was jealousy there, it was only that it ended, and so it wasn't jealousy to George. It was jealousy that George had been taken away from him, that they couldn't continue to work together and create new songs, and for George to go on and write a symphony and the other things that he supposedly was thinking of in those last years.
Yeah, I think for me, that scene you describe of when Ira is at the hospital and comes home, and Ira is at least told that the surgery for his brain tumor was successful and George would be okay, and that turned out to be a little bit of wishful thinking, but it's really pretty devastating, sort of what that scene and Ira and how George's family, the whole Gershwin clan, responded to George's death. I mean, it was just sort of like this meteor being snuffed out.
It was George Gershwin was known to be a hypochondriac, and had complained for many years of what was referred to as a composer's stomach, and he would go on various what were then sort of faddish diets. So the idea that perhaps George was acting a little strangely, if that's the right
He was
word.
complaining about headaches or whatever.
Yeah, complaining
you know,
about headaches,
seemed
and,
like anything big.
that wasn't necessarily something that was totally new. And so the idea that it was something different than that it was something more than that, even to Ira being so close to George, he just couldn't see it, or he didn't want to see it. And the fact that it all happened so quickly, that the final illness was just in a matter of days at the end,
Mhm.
put Ira in a state of total disbelief that kept him from almost doing anything for 2.5 years from July 1937. So it's a moment, it's a turning point for Ira. It's a turning point in the book. How is he going to carry on at that point?
Yeah, there were two
without
parts of that.
George?
I think two parts that surprised me. One is that, I'd always heard that Ira was devastated and he couldn't write after George's death. But in fact, he had to work right away because they had a contract for a movie, and
Yeah.
he was forced to work almost immediately, at least for a very brief amount of time. And then I think the other thing which you mentioned in that section is that Ira felt guilty, about George's death. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think there was it's the pain of the reality, of being there physically, Ira being there and seeing what was happening to his brother, and yet not fully comprehending it is going to tear at you
Mm-hmm.
after, particularly if it ends tragically as it did in this case. And so it puts you in a frame of mind where you are struggling with yourself. You're struggling with how you reacted in such a seemingly poor way to something that devastated everybody. And Ira, more than because he and George were so close, that the figure of George, his sort of his presence after his death, was in a way haunted Ira.
Mm-hmm.
And it was never really going to go away. And having all of George's materials still with him, and his piano and some of his paintings, his collection of paintings, he wanted to still be surrounded by his brother, even though being surrounded by his brother and living next door to the house in which he lived when he passed away was a way to keep him close to him, but also was a somewhat sad reminder of what he had kind of failed to accomplish.
Some interesting questions coming in about New York during the time when George and I were growing up. Like, how did that affect them? Were they connected to, for example, the Yiddish theater, or what is it about sort of Manhattan and his upbringing that you think ended up influencing Ira's art?
Manhattan was the place to be at that time in the United States. It seemed if you wanted to be creative, and both Ira and George had a creative gene in them, and so to be at that place where there's this maelstrom of new thoughts and new music and new writing and new styles of writing, and then being exposed to the physicality of the Lower East Side. And not that the Gershwins were poor by any stretch of the imagination, but they lived in that general ambiance, I should say. And so it just, everything sort of mixed together. And the newspaper columnists and other writers who Ira admired, he could read them every day in the newspaper and be influenced by them. And that really wasn't going to happen somewhere else in the United States. The question about the Yiddish theater, and that there is some evidence that the Gershwins were aware of it, but it wasn't necessarily something that particularly influenced them, not particularly Ira's writing.
Yeah, I think one interesting story that comes out in your book is sort of how the piano sort of came into the Gershwin fold, and also how books and the library played a role in Ira's early childhood. Can you talk about those two things?
Well, the piano is somewhat of an apocryphal story. I mean, the details are somewhat apocryphal. Mm-hmm. So Ira, being the oldest child, was intended to be the person for whom the piano was coming into the house. He was supposed to be taking the lessons, and he was supposed to be learning. And so it was supposedly hauled in through the window of the house that they were.
And it sounded like, that his parents really wanted the piano to help sort of bring him out of his shell in a way,
In a certain way. I think they weren't certain where he wanted to go, where he was going with his life. But also, I think the idea of having a piano in the house was popular at that period of time, just like it was to have other sorts of music in the house. And so Ira sat down at the piano, and before he even started to play, supposedly George kind of pushed him off the bench and started playing this melody with a beautiful left hand and all this. And Ira was just sort of happily went off and said, "Okay, I'm done with that, and I'm going to go back to my books, and I'll be happy." And so, and he went to the libraries, all basically, all the branches of the libraries in New York City, and eventually had a huge library of his own, particularly filled with volumes of light verse, which was his favorite form of writing, and what he really wanted to do initially was to be that sort of a writer who could turn out little pieces of verse. But even though he went in a different direction, it still influenced the tone of a lot of his lyrics, because he was from that generation where that was such a big influence.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about sort of what Ira did before he became the lyricist with George, and I think you make a pretty convincing case for me, and I know it's in your edition of the diary, or that he kept, his notebook, when they were touring Europe in 1928, how sort of frugal Ira was, or at least aware of money. Like, he was always tracking money. And so there was really a eureka moment for me when I realized that, because of his, of Morris's, of his dad's sort of carefree attitude towards money, that Ira had a very different attitude for money. But can you talk a little bit about the kinds of jobs that Ira had before he finally started writing lyrics?
Sure. Well, his father, Morris, had a lot of different businesses during Ira's childhood and his young manhood. And on at least a couple of occasions, Morris and a relative ran bathhouses in Manhattan and Lower East Side. And at different times, Ira was the cashier at the bathhouse. He worked at Altman's department store in the shipping department. He worked when he was young. He worked as an assistant to one of his uncles, who was a photographer in Brighton Beach, and wound up taking photos himself. Initially he was just helping, but he would do that. But he
worked as a cashier for a circus too, didn't he?
He was a cashier for a circus. Yes, that is probably one of the more outlandish moments of Ira's early life, and was actually the longest period of time that he spent away from his family. He went on the road with a cousin's traveling circus as the cashier again, which he said was just really a fake job, but he got to meet the freaks and the geeks, as they used to say about circus life, and the people who came to these performances, and their dialects, and the things that they said, and the music that they listened to. And so these sort of things helped him when he got back to New York, deciding that that was not the life for him. He was always listening. He was always listening to what people were saying. He was always listening to what people were thinking about, and how they said it, and the phrases they used, and whether somebody would cut the last few letters off of a word so that it came out differently, like fashion became fash, and that turned up in Ira's lyrics, or the sibilance of is wonderful, is marvelous. Those sorts of things, because he took that to heart, that you didn't have to actually do all these things to write about them. You could actually just sit back, relax, watch what people are doing, kind of like on the cover of my book, and then turn that into a lyric if the occasion arose.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that comes really to the fore for me, is how much of an observer he was. Like he was maybe shy or retiring, or maybe more introverted than George, but he was very engaged. I mean, he's listening to all the quirks in the world around him, and in some ways gathering, raw material for his lyrics that are going to come forward. So we've got one interesting question sort of about Gershwin's engagement with politics, and of course you mentioned of the I Sing and sort of the political musicals, but was Ira very engaged with politics?
Not particularly. I think he would be known as an FDR Democrat, definitely. And he was very patriotic, and in a different way than perhaps we look at that word now. But during the war years, the years of the Second World War, he wrote songs for to help with Russian war relief, or to help the Chinese against the communist Chinese at the time. But he donated money to a lot of organizations that were, which you would have said were pro-democracy ones, anti-fascist organizations. And some of that kind of got him in trouble in the early 1950s, when there was the witch hunt, communist witch hunt, and although he never had to testify in Washington, but he was called up before a similar committee in California about a meeting that was held at his house for something called the Committee for the First Amendment, which was a group of Hollywood stars and writers and directors who were concerned about what was going on in Washington, D.C., as far as trying to root out the Reds in Hollywood. And he actually and very strange for him, he actually accompanied Gene Kelly and John Huston to Washington, D.C. for a hearing in Washington, D.C. that had to do with this, and not something that you would normally have thought Ira Gershwin would have done. But he was not a political man, but he looked at all of these things. He looked at politics from a satirical viewpoint. So the political musicals that he worked on with George and George S. Kaufman and Maury Ruskin, Strike Up the Band, and The I Sing, and particularly Let 'Em Eat Cake, the sequel, were, they ranged from a sort of lighthearted satire to Let 'Em Eat Cake being what Ira called a satire on just about everything, and somewhat dark satire. But that was probably about as deep as he ever got into it.
Yeah, I was fascinated by all the insights in your book around Ira's craft as a lyricist and sort of his discoveries or the things that he thought were really important when writing a lyric. And I was struck by just his the original take that he would have on turns of phrases or rhyming. So could you talk just a little bit about as we listen to Gershwin songs and we're sort of enveloped in these harmonies and melodies from George, what should we pay attention to in the words and to the craft of the lyricist that really brings Ira's art to the fore?
Well, one of the things that he said, and he mentioned, I mentioned it in my little talk, that he wrote a book called Lyrics on Several Occasions, which is on the shelf behind me, where he goes into a lot of detail about how certain songs were written and what form the lyric took. But one of the things that he said was that it was finding the title of a song, finding the right title for a specific song that would fit in, if it was a song written for a show or written for a movie, that would fit into the character and fit into the plot. The title was vital, he said. And if you've it, prove it, he said. So if you listen to a Gershwin lyric, an Ira Gershwin lyric, if you think about the title and then you listen to the lyrics that go with it, if the lyrics make sense with the title, then he has done his job. But if they don't, for some reason, then there are plenty of songs that where the title just has nothing to do with the lyric, or the lyric has nothing to do with the title. You'll see that he's done his job. Now, for a man who wrote over 700 songs, there are bound to be some songs where that doesn't really work. But when he was at the top of his game, that was something that he focused on.
Yeah. One of the things, we did a performance here at Michigan of the I Sing, and there was a performance of Strike Up the Band I heard recently in New York. And one of the things that struck me is that in the 1920s and 30s, you didn't have amplification systems with all these individual microphones on all of the performers. And so the audibility of the lyric was really so important to the experience of the audience. And for me, it's almost a game when you hear Ira's rhyming to sort of guess what the next word is. And there's a way in which the rhyming actually, I don't know, it sort of helps convey the words at a time when it was probably pretty hard to hear the lyrics in at least certain parts of the theater.
It was one of the things that he complained about, was that if the pit band was particularly loud, and on Girl Crazy in 1930, you had a number of jazz musicians in the pit, Benny Goodman and Jimmy Dorsey and Gene Krupa, going to be very loud.
Drummers are not subtle.
Ira knew that his lyrics were, if people caught every other word, maybe that would be good. And of course, it depends upon the singer too. I mean, in the 20s, you had a lot of performers whose voices did not carry very well. They weren't Ethel Merman. Adele Astaire and Fred Astaire's sister, and Queenie Smith, who was the star of Tiptoes. They had very light voices and nice voices, but not voices that would get a song across. And one of the stories in the book is about how unsuccessful The Man I Love was initially, because it was sung by Adele Astaire in The Man I Love, but she couldn't quite get across that the passion in the song, and so it went from show to show and failed there, and then but was finally taken up as an individual song. And as it started to be recorded, people could hear the lyrics. And so recordings were actually quite valuable for Ira in terms of, well, not just in terms of the monetary value of them, they were that, but also for listeners to actually hear what it was that he said. as long as the singer was paying attention to what he said and wasn't changing his lyrics, which he would get a little peeved about sometimes.
Yeah, I know we're sort of running a little bit close on time, so probably only have time for a couple questions left. One comes in as really about the influence of W.S. Gilbert and Sullivan on Ira's art, and particularly, what did Ira know about Gilbert's early ballads and being set to music, and
Yes, well, Gilbert was probably his earliest influence as a lyricist. His father had Gilbert and Sullivan records at home, and Ira would crank the Victrola and listen to them. And he had a copy of the Fab Ballads, and he had when he met Yip Harburg in school,
went to grade school with,
when
yeah,
they were young men. And he was the one who told Harburg, did you know that these words were actually set to music? So Gilbert came across particularly, I think, in the political musicals where Ira had a chance to write longer scenes, and not the scenes that would actually describe the plot and would go on for 10 minutes or 12 minutes, and not just be a 3 or 4 minute song, but could carry the production along. And so he relished those opportunities, which were kind of few and far between.
All right. Well, final question from me before we bring Margaret back, but is how did you get into Ira Gershwin? What led you down this pathway, and how, as you reflect back on the book and what you've discovered about Ira, what either surprised you or maybe has influenced your own way of living because you've become so close to your subject over all these years?
Well, I kind of got into this by accident. In a way, I guess I was in the right place at the right time. I had, prior to starting working for the Gershwin estate, Ira Gershwin's estate, which I have now been working for almost 25 years. I had worked as an accountant, and I was having a career change, and I was going back to school and working on a library degree, a history degree, and I got a call from an agency that I was working for, an employment agency, saying there was a temporary job at the offices of the Ira Gershwin estate in San Francisco to do a large photocopying job of some papers that belonged to one of Ira's attorneys. And so I went, and they hired me, and eventually I wound up in 2005 managing the archive after the death of the Trust's executive director. But I should say that the papers that I did all that photocopying of in the summer of 2000 were actually vital parts of writing the book, because although a lot of it was business paperwork, there was a lot in there, a lot of letters from Ira to his attorney that didn't just talk about legal things, but to talk about his career and different songs. And as far as how it's affected me, I think I kind of like to go by Ira's motto, "Biden my time." So it's kind of sitting back and trying to look at things with a little more of a relaxed, jaundiced eye, perhaps, and not try to jump at everything right away, but sit back and try to relax a bit.
Well, thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation and a fantastic book.
No, thank you, Mark.
Really. And thank
Nice to
you,
talk to you.
Mark, for some great questions, and Michael, for this really illuminating discussion. We have learned a lot. I say hooray for temp jobs. And I also say,
Me too.
yeah, I have met a lot of great people doing temp jobs, and a lot of them have turned into careers for people. I don't feel that goes on these days, but you know what? We have to believe it does. And also hooray for Gilbert and Sullivan. I know we have a lot of fans of Gilbert and Sullivan on with us. So thank you so much for all that you've taught us. And as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Michael to do a final reading from his book. So over to you for that.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me on. So, Rubin Mamoulian, the Russian-born director of the original 1927 theatrical adaptation of the novel Porgy and the opera Porgy and Bess, had an intimate view of the working and personal relationship between Ira and George Gershwin, these two men who had come so far from their origins as the sons of immigrant parents. As George and Ira prepared to play through the score of the opera, Mamoulian watched Ira stand over his brother like a guardian angel. The pair blissfully closed their eyes before they performed Summertime, and while George played with the most beatific smile on his face, Ira threw his head back with abandon, his eyes closed, and sang like a nightingale. It was touching, Mamoulian wrote, to see how he, while singing, would become so overwhelmed with admiration for his brother that he would look from him to me with half-open eyes and pantomime with a soft gesture of his hand, as if saying, "He did it. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't he wonderful?"
Thank you so much. As a family history organization, we love these brothers' partnerships. And Porgy and Bess, what a phenomenal accomplishment. I mean, history making on so many levels. Thank you for taking us behind the scenes, Michael. Your book is such a gift. Your years worth of archives paying off for all of us listening to this and those of us who read your book. It provides such a great understanding of immigrant families, their successes, and Ira's truly remarkable way with words. Your appendices at the back of all the lyrics and all the shows and the notes, really, really helpful to those of us who follow this closely. A reminder to our audience, copies of the hardcover Ira Gershwin can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As you order from the bookstore, input the code AMINS24 and your copy will come signed by the author on a book plate. The bookstore can send these special books to you, your friends, or your family anywhere in the United States. This is a perfect holiday gift for music lovers in your life. I'm getting it for several of my friends. Winding down our evening, first, Kristen, tell us what's upcoming at the Boston Public Library.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Michael and Mark. And thank you all for joining us. Just very quickly, at the Boston Public Library, you can find out more at bpl.org or your local branch. Or if you're not here in the Boston area, check out your local library. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you for joining us. Margaret, back over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. We at American Ancestors are delighted to have presented tonight's book talk in partnership. If you're researching a time, a person, or a family like the Gershwins, my colleagues are here to help you. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs that provide skills for family historians. You'll see on screen some of these offerings. Our mission in all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect. And for you literary sorts, first, I want to thank Susan Kay and John D. Thompson for their support of this series and for tonight's book talk. Thank you for your support, you two. A look ahead, on December 17, we'll jump overseas to talk about the great houses of Britain and their surprising connections to America. Our special guest author is my colleague, Kurt DiCamillo, who is an expert on these grand homes. His new book, The British Country House Alphabet, is full of insight and some whimsy. Register by Friday, and we can guarantee that your signed book will arrive in time for holiday giving. In the new year, on January 14, we're venturing onto the high seas with Brit author Nicholas Nugent. He'll share some gorgeously illustrated maps and new works. His book, The Spice Ports. Really interesting to hear about these ports. He will be in dialogue with maritime historian William Fowler. And save the date of January 27 for a special program featuring the Pulitzer Prize winning historian Alan Taylor presenting his new book, This Fierce People, The Untold Story of American Revolutionary War in the South. He'll be in conversation with Ryan J. Woods, President and CEO of American Ancestors. They'll unpack the craft of writing history. So if we learned about writing lyrics tonight, that night we'll learn about writing history. Finally, something new and exciting. We've just opened registrations for our first ever American Inspiration Literary Tour. In May 2025, we'll be attending the Santa Fe International Literary Festival and touring the New Mexico haunts of such writers as Willa Cather and D.H. Lawrence. The link to learn more is in the chat. We hope you'll join us in New Mexico. Back to tonight, many thanks to our guests, Michael Owen and Mark Clegg, joining us at such a busy time of year. We are grateful for your time, and also to the GBH Forum Network for their work, to producer Kathleen McKenzie behind the scenes, thank you. And to all of you who tuned in, thank you. We really appreciate your interest in America's history, its battlefields, and its cultural history alike. We will hope to see you soon again. For now, a very good night to all of you, and thank you for joining us, particularly you two gentlemen. Have a good night.